Welcome back. I recognize that we're covering a lot this week, but we haven't really talked much in detail about style, and I want to make sure you get a good lesson in it because this is where you get to have a lot of fun. Style, if you'll remember, has a lot to do with language use, and so I've pulled a couple of quotations from some of my favorite people who've talked about language and the power of language. The first is from rhetorician Kenneth Burke, who was a big figure in my field in the 20th century. And Burke says men seek for themselves, men or women, seek for themselves vocabularies that are reflections of reality. To this end, they must develop vocabularies that are selections of reality, and any selection of reality must, in certain circumstances, function as a deflection of reality. What I think Burke is getting at here is that we want our language to be perfect, and we want it to reflect the world around us. We want to be able to express ourselves clearly in ways that other people will relate to and understand. We want to make sure that our language is really capturing what we mean when we say things. And so Burke, I think, recognizes that human beings want language to function like a mirror, and they want it to be perfect. And what he's saying here is that very rarely do we ever actually get that. Very rarely is our language so clear and so specific and so detailed that it's really like a mirror that we just hold up to reality and everybody agrees upon what we mean. What he says instead is basically that every time that we use language, language itself is imperfect by nature. And sometimes we have to pick and choose how we express things. So instead of a reflection, instead of a mirror of reality, what he's saying is we're kind of we're picking and choosing what we decide to use when we talk about the world. And every choice that we make is also a choice of what not to include. So we have selections of reality that try to capture as much as we can in the best ways that we can, but pretty much anytime we use language, we're going to miss something, or we're going to have something get misinterpreted, or something's not going to be entirely clear. So that's one way of thinking about language. Another person who takes a similar approach to language is the playwright Bertolt Brecht. Brecht said that you might replace art with language. Art is not a mirror to reflect reality, but a hammer with which to shape it. And so what Burke is saying is that we want language to be kind of like a mirror, but we never really get there. And I think what Brecht is saying is really that we use language in powerful ways that shape our reality. Not only do we always select and deflect when we make language choices, but every selection and deflection that we make is political in some way. We are constantly using language to try not to reflect the world around us, but to try and create or shape the world around us. I think these are two really good ways to think about the power of language, and we have to be really careful with the ways that we use language so that we're using it in the best ways that we can. Now, there's a lot of different ways to think about language, and so I've got a couple of strategies for you here. The first one is really to try and be creative. Like I said before, style is really where you get to have fun with your speech. This is where it is most authentically you, and you get to be yourself in the ways that are most fun to you and the ways that really highlight your personality. So I want you to have fun with your language choices. I don't want you to just go with the first thing that comes to mind, but really to play around with things until they sound really good to you in the best way that you can express yourselves. That said, I also want to encourage you to be cautious because sometimes we can be a little bit too creative. And you want to make sure that what you're doing in your language choices is appropriate. You want to make sure that it's appropriate for both the people in your audience, but also for the setting that you're in or the occasion that you're speaking on. To give you an example, I kind of kick myself now for not being one of the speakers at my high school graduation. We had auditions for that. I was too afraid and I didn't want to participate. And I'm really sad about that because our actual high school graduation speakers both did things that made their audiences pretty uncomfortable. They didn't quite understand how to read the occasion. So I kid you not that one of our graduation speakers got up and literally sang the song Graduation by Vitamin C. The song's a little old, some of you might not know it, but it's terrible, and you might have heard it in some context. It's, as we go on, we remember all the times we had together. It's really cliche and awful, and she literally just got up and sang that song and then had a little bit of extra speech that she tacked onto it, but everyone had already heard the song and they were tired of it. The other commencement speaker did a pretty nice job and got through his whole speech, but the way that he ended in his conclusion made a lot of people really uncomfortable. He ended his speech by saying, "and in the year of our Lord," and then the year that we graduated. In some settings, that would be fine, but this was a public high school in suburban Minneapolis, and a lot of people in the audience were not only not Christian, but not religious. And so it kind of put a damper on the rest of his speech to members of his audience that were not identifying with what he was saying. So you want to be sensitive to the politics of the moment, and you want to be sensitive to the reason you're being asked to speak and the people who are in your audience as much as you possibly can. Another thing that you want to be aware of is what a lot of people will call connotation. So there's denotation and connotation. Denotation is what happens when you look at a word in the dictionary. It's the closest we get to an agreed upon meaning for a word, and we recognize that some words have multiple meanings, and so they get multiple dictionary definitions. And obviously, if you're not sure what a word means, you want to make sure that you're using it correctly. But connotation is a little bit different. Connotation is not the agreed upon meaning of a word, but rather the other words or other emotions that that word triggers in people. So you might think of how you want to express yourself emotionally, because some words you might not mean to be offensive or you might not mean to be uncomfortable. And members of your audience might go to places in their minds that you didn't intend to send them. So you want to be careful with connotation and not just with denotation, direct dictionary definition of a word. When we're talking about shades of meaning, that's closely related to connotation. Those are just kinds of different matters of degree. So we have differences. If I say, yeah, your paper was pretty good, or that was a great paper, or you did a really nice job, or that was excellent, or that was the best paper that I've ever seen, those are all different shades of meaning. And we have lots of different ways of expressing continuums of words in our language. So you want to make sure that you're in the right spot on that continuum and that you're not exaggerating or oversimplifying things as well. Another thing to be careful with is grammatical correctness and pronunciation. Also articulation goes along with that. So you want to make sure that you're using terms correctly. You want to make sure that you're saying them correctly. A lot of people will say things like nuclear, right? That isn't the correct pronunciation of nuclear. And it's very easy to fall into traps with this. And it does affect how your audience thinks of you. So you might not think spelling and grammar matters all that much. Well, spelling certainly doesn't matter in speech, but grammar people will pick up on and might use against you. So you want to be careful with that. Another thing that can be troublesome for some speakers is just being appropriate to what we call political correctness. And I know that not everyone likes the term political correctness and don't really like having to abide by political correctness. What that's referring to is just trying to say things in a way that's not offensive to certain groups of people. So you might have grown up and you might have heard someone say that's gay or that's retarded, and members of the LGBT community or people with special needs might take offense to that kind of language. So political correctness is about trying to use terms that are less offensive, and it's not just people of a certain character that violate political correctness. A lot of people associate political correctness with the left, but people on the left sometimes violate norms of political correctness as well. To give you an example, a few years ago, President Obama was on one of the late night shows, and he said something like, "Watching me bowl is like watching the Special Olympics." Well, people with special needs and organizations that represent them got really offended by that and wanted to correct the president and say that wasn't really the best kind of thing to say. Now, obviously, there are ways that political correctness can be a little bit overdone and can be a little bit challenging, but it's really easy to lose your authority and to lose your credibility or lose your ethos with an audience. Once you've done that, it's really hard to get it back. And so you want to be really careful. Even if you don't like political correctness, you might still need it in certain settings. Another thing that I strongly recommend, and something that I write on a lot of student speeches, is to show something rather than to tell us about it. And when I say that, what I usually mean is you're either really abstract and general and not being specific enough, or it means that you could describe things in ways that speak to people a little bit more, usually with sensory detail of some kind. People respond really well to things that they can see and smell and hear and touch. And we want to make sure that you captivate your audience and that you're not just describing things, but you really pull them in with vivid details and imagery. So that's what I'd recommend there. Last but not least, I think it's really important that you are trying to be yourself. This goes along with that creative expression. That creative expression is to show your personality. Don't try to be someone else in your speech. Really try to be authentically you. You'll sound most natural, you'll be most comfortable when you're trying to be yourself and not trying to imitate what you think you should be. Another way of thinking about style has to do with high, medium, and low style. And what this refers to is kind of that heavy, dense philosophical language and philosophical long sentences that drag on forever versus kind of everyday vernacular language that we use in conversation. I mentioned that there's like a wide range between reading Heidegger and reading the internet and comment sections. So the internet and comment sections kind of run in low style. High philosophy obviously runs in high style. If you take a second to read this slide, I'm curious if any of you recognize what this is. I've taken something that was written in low style and rewritten it in high style. So take a second to read it, see if you can figure it out. So if any of you are country music fans, this song's a little bit old, but not that old. It's the song Chicken Fried by the Zac Brown Band. This is what it looks like in the original. Pretty different experience, right? High, medium, and low style are different ways of reaching different audiences. Oftentimes they'll signal intelligence or they'll signal class or some kind of level of sophistication. And a lot of students, especially beginning students in speech, think that they need to speak in high style. They need to try and sound smarter than they actually are, or they need to try and sound really sophisticated. Most audiences really enjoy it if you speak to the style that they're used to speaking in. Most of us in our everyday conversation don't really speak in high style or low style. We kind of speak in a medium style that's between the two. And so I'd encourage you, if you see yourself as speaking more in the low style or the high style, to temper your language and try and go for that happy medium. Audiences like people who sound like them. And so you don't have to try too hard to please your audience. You should just try and speak in a way that most people speak in everyday conversation. There's a couple other things that can be really helpful in terms of getting your audience to pay attention. I mentioned when we talked about arrangement that speaking and writing have some differences, and one of those differences is that people, when listening to speeches, are sometimes able to tune out, and it's harder for them to tune back in. So there's lots of different figures of speech that are available, and these are just language strategies, they're linguistic devices to pull your audience back in and say, hey, this thing that I'm talking about right now is important. You should probably pay attention to it. It's a way of getting your audience to think a little bit instead of just kind of hearing things and having them go in one ear and out the other. So one that you might be familiar with is simile and metaphor. These are just comparisons, using one thing to express another thing. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I was writing a long paper, about a 40-page paper, on Obama's first inaugural address. And I was listening to this speech, and it was this really big historical moment. For a lot of people, Obama was, as the first black president, someone who was a very polarizing figure, but whether people liked or disliked him, they were kind of waiting with anticipation to hear what he was going to say when he took office. And a lot of people really pay close attention to inaugural addresses. I remember huddling around a TV and listening to him speak and thinking I was going to write this long paper on this. And so what I ended up doing was looking at the way he was talking about things. So this was back in 2009, and some of you probably remember 2009 pretty well. Others of you might not remember it so well. But Obama was getting up to speak, and this was right after, kind of at the height of the recession. So a lot of people were really worried about the economy, jobs were starting to get cut, people were really feeling doubtful. In addition to that, we had wars going in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we had a lot of people who were pretty upset with the previous administration. Even if they voted for George W. Bush, a lot of people at this point were not happy with the way that he ran things toward the end of his presidency. So people were waiting for Obama to get up and speak, and they knew that he was going to address the big issues of the day, the economy, and the wars, and everything else that was going on kind of culturally. And he gets up and he talks about the economy in terms of natural disasters. So I've pulled some quotations here from the speech. He talks about the economy and the war in terms of gathering clouds, and raging storms, and the winter of our hardship, icy currents. And so I'm curious, if you take a second, what do you make of those metaphors? Do you like those metaphors? Do you think those are good ways of describing the economy or war? What do you make of them? Just think to yourself for a moment. I don't know that there's an exact science to figuring out how people respond to metaphor. I don't think there is. It's, like I said, public speaking is more of an art than a science in the way that I see it. But I was a little concerned with the way that he was using these metaphors. And the reason was that when you think of natural disasters, there's two questions that come to my mind. The first is, who's responsible for cleaning up after a natural disaster? Okay, you might point to government, but a lot of people weren't too optimistic about the way the government had been running things. People might think of federal aid, or hospital workers and police and firemen, people like that. Might be a possible answer, but most of the time after a natural disaster, there's kind of this void of leadership until the natural disaster is cleared. It usually takes a little bit of time. And so as a new president, one thing that's a little concerning about this metaphor is that it basically signals, well, I'm supposed to be in charge, but maybe this is bigger than me. You know, some people, when they think of natural disasters and cleaning things up again, if you happen to be religious, they might think of like God or another higher power of some kind being in charge of that. But it's not really entirely clear who's in charge of fixing a natural disaster. The other question that came to my mind here is, after a natural disaster, how long does it usually take to clean up? You've probably seen the footage of Hurricane Harvey recently, and maybe we'll see some more footage of Hurricane Irma in the next couple of days. But is it usually just a couple of hours before people clean things up? A couple days, a couple weeks, a couple months? It's usually a pretty long time. And I think a lot of people were really impatient with not knowing and being uncertain and being uncomfortable. So President Obama took office, and basically he was saying nobody's really in charge here, or it's unclear who's in charge here. And they were also saying, well, this is going to take a long time to fix. I'm not here to criticize the president. I'm not here to get political. I'm just kind of thinking about the metaphors here and what they might imply. And so I want you to think very critically in terms of your own metaphors that you might use, because sometimes, again, connotation can mean different things to different people, and you might signal something that you don't want to signal. Another figure of speech that's helpful is repetition. So some of you might have seen Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And toward the end of that speech, he repeats the words, let freedom ring. Let freedom ring from this place. Let freedom ring from that place. Let freedom ring from that place. And then after that gets into, well, I see this happening. I have a dream today. I have a dream today. I have a dream today. Now, what that does in speech is, again, helps your audience snap back into your speech and say, hey, this thing's important. I should probably tune into it. In an English class, you might have a professor who say, that's redundant. You don't need all of those. Cut that out. In speech, repetition of the exact word or phrases can be a really good way to draw your audience back in. Closely related to repetition is parallelism. So rather than repeating the exact words over and over and over again, what you do instead is tweak the words a little bit, but repeat the same structure. And that's a way of saying that these things are similar, and they're similar in ways that you should recognize them and pay attention, but also they have subtle differences. And so it kind of encourages your audience to create a Venn diagram in their heads of what are the similarities and what are the differences here. So I've pulled an example of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, government of the people, by the people, for the people. It's similar words, it's similar structure, but all three of those things are very different. Think about what those differences might be as you're thinking about those similarities and see if you might be able to figure out what Lincoln's getting at there. Another strategy is to use an acrostic. An acrostic is basically just a fancy way of taking a word and making it about something else. So you might have heard of the DREAM Act or the Patriot Act. The DREAM Act stands for Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors. The Patriot Act, I have listed here as well. It takes a word that's memorable and breaks it down so you can have several steps that boil down to an easy, memorable, one-word response. This is a good way of getting your audience to pay attention to connected parts of something. So if you are thinking about your deliberations, this might be how you provide your policy that you recommend. You might take something, a word, and see if you can create a clever breakdown of that word in a way that's memorable. Acrostics can be really useful for kind of a shorthand to get your audience to remember the key points of what you're talking about. Parallipsis is one of my favorite figures of speech. Parallipsis is a really good way of calling attention to something that you're uncomfortable with. It's kind of a slimy, dodgy term. It's kind of a slimy and dodgy figure of speech. And the reason that I like it is because the people who use it are kind of using it in a tricky way. What parallipsis means is saying, well, I'm not saying X, but I'm actually saying X. And it's a way of kind of getting your audience to entertain an idea without necessarily going through the full details of that idea. So parallipsis is kind of a fun one that you can play around with, but I'd encourage you to be cautious with it because people do sometimes pick up on the fact that you're actually saying X and you're trying not to say X. So that's another fun one that I just find really interesting. I have a few more of these. There are a lot of them. I'm not going to have you learn all of them, but they're just ways to get your audience to pay attention again. So another one that you're probably familiar with is alliteration. And that's just the repetition of the same sound at the beginning of words. So here you have from The Wizard of Oz, you clinking, clanking, clattering collection of caliginous junk, and you billowing bale of bovine fodder. That repetition of sounds is a way of getting your audience to snap back into a speech as well. This is one of my favorite clips that also uses alliteration.
I can assure you I mean you no harm. Who are you? Who is but the form following the function of what, and what I am is a man in a mask.
I can see that.
Of course you can. I'm not questioning your powers of observation. I'm merely remarking upon the paradox of asking a masked man who he is.
Oh, right.
But on this most auspicious of nights, permit me then, in lieu of the more commonplace sobriquet, to suggest the character of this dramatis persona. Voilà! In view, a humble vaudevillian veteran, cast vicariously as both victim and villain by the vicissitudes of fate. This visage, no mere veneer of vanity, is a vestige of the vox populi, now vacant, vanished. However, this valorous visitation of a bygone vexation stands vivified, and has vowed to vanquish these venal and virulent vermin, vanguarding vice and vouchsafing the violently vicious and voracious violation of Phyllisher. The only verdict is vengeance, a vendetta, held as a votive, not in vain, for the value and veracity of such shall one day vindicate the vigilant and the virtuous. Verily, this vicious swaz of verbiage veers most verbose, so let me simply add that it's my very good honor to meet you, and you may call me V.
Are you like a crazy person?
I'm quite sure they will say so.
That's one of my favorites because we have a lot of words in the English language that start with the letter V that we don't use all that often. You might not have even recognized a lot of the words that are in there. If any of you want to look them up, it's actually a very clever, very well-composed speech, basically calling for a revolution. But that repetition of that V sound that we're not used to hearing is another way of emphasizing what it is he's trying to say in a very clever way. I've got a few more of these for you here. Another favorite of mine is antithesis. Antithesis is just an intentional pairing together of opposites to highlight dramatic effect. Most of the time, antithesis is used to draw attention to some kind of horrible contradiction. It's a way of setting up a problem that needs to be solved. So I've pulled an example from Richard Nixon's inaugural address. Nixon, at the time when he took office, said, "We're rich in goods but ragged in spirit. We're reaching toward the moon but falling toward the earth. We're caught in war wanting peace. We're torn by division. We're wanting unity." All of those opposites get you to think, hey, there's a lot of weird things going on in the world right now, and we need someone who can come in and fix those things. And I'm not saying that Nixon was necessarily the person to go in and fix some of those problems, but using opposites paired together that way really calls attention to drama and calls attention to conflict and cognitive dissonance in ways that set you up really well to solve a problem. So that's a fun one as well. One more that you might be familiar with is JFK's famous "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Antimetaboly is similar to parallelism in that it takes a structure and kind of repeats it. The difference with antimetaboly is that it takes that structure and inverts it. And I think that's another way of getting people to think critically about what they're doing and what they should be doing. And so that's kind of a fun one as well. I'm not going to bore you all day with all of these. If you really want to learn more of them, there are fun ones like anaphora and polysyndeton and synecdoche. There's a whole list of a bunch of them on a website called Silva Rhetorica. So if any of you are interested in that, and I don't expect you to be, you can check that out. These are, a lot of them, 2,000 or more years old, ways of talking about the different ways that people try to get attention from their audience. And so you can learn the different kinds, and then you can employ them in your actual speeches. Just another thing that can make speech a little bit more fun, a little bit more engaging for your audience. Skip ahead here. There we go. In addition to some of these strategies, I've also noticed a lot of challenges that a lot of people have faced. I've watched a lot of speeches, and I've seen speech and style go wrong. So I want to help you avoid some of those common problems as well. One of those problems is really just not being creative, using a bunch of cliches, using a lot of words that are dull and boring. You want to, again, try to reach for those vivid sensory details and try to think of words that are more precise and more creative and more expressive. Another problem that people run into is they sometimes use a lot of jargon. Jargon is one of my favorite words in the English language. It's a fancy word for fancy words. What it basically means is it's a word that is used only within a particular community, and it's really specific and really complicated, and a lot of people don't know it. And so a lot of people will use very community-specific words. A lot of times these are technical terms drawn from your field. You want to try to avoid this kind of language, or if you're going to use it, you want to make sure that you explain it and don't just assume that your audience knows what it is that you're talking about. You want to try and use the word in the correct way as well. There's lots of ways to use jargon wrong, especially if you're just trying it out for the first time and you're not entirely sure what it means. So this often happens when people try to sound smarter than they actually are. Another problem is having too much clutter in your ideas. This is a habit that even I'm trying to break. Academic writing kind of trains you to use a lot of different ideas in the same sentence, and I've had, even at the graduate level, people tell me that, that's a run-on sentence. Did you mean to have that sentence go on that long? And no, most of the time I don't. Long sentences can sometimes be helpful in writing as a way of highlighting the connections among a whole lot of ideas. They're not so good for speech for a couple of reasons. One is that your audience will sometimes get lost and try to follow 4 or 5 ideas in the same sentence. They can't really, their brain doesn't work that way. It doesn't last that long. But the other challenge that comes with having really cluttered ideas is that you, as the speaker, sometimes have too many things going on that you forget mid-sentence what it is you're trying to say. And so it's better to use simple sentences and shorter sentences a lot of the time than to try and have these long, complex, or compound complex sentences. Really just keep it simple, and you'll find that you and your audience have a better time following along. Another concern we already talked about is anything that might be perceived as offensive or derogatory. We're going to talk about this more in terms of audience analysis in a few weeks, and it's not to say that you can't push the envelope every once in a while, or that it's not okay to swear, or, different audiences will have different expectations in terms of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. What you want to be careful of is when you're trying to say something and somebody else might perceive it as really not what you intended. So this is, when you're trying to be nice, or you're trying to be inclusive, or you're trying to say something and you don't realize how offensive it could come across to somebody else. So we'll talk about this a little bit more. And again, it's not to be language police. It's not to be totally supportive of political correctness, but it's more to protect your own ethos as a speaker. Another problem is weak transitions. A lot of speakers will not really switch up their transitions. They'll use the same transition over and over again. I've even caught myself in this lesson using another, and I'm going to try and break myself of that habit. We all fall into this from time to time. The best way around that is to try and look for different ways of expressing the same relationship. So I mentioned that there's a handout in the useful materials folder for different transition words and phrases, and I'd encourage you to take a look at that if you find yourself using the same ones over and over and over again. To give you some more examples to help you think through this, that jargon language that I talked about that's really specific usually happens when people try to sound smarter than they are. So again, this is a reminder to be yourself. It happens to come from one of my favorite television shows. Some of you might be familiar with the show Friends. There's an episode in Friends where Joey, who is not the smartest character, is writing a letter of recommendation for his friends Chandler and Monica to get a baby. And he wants to say something nice about them, but he doesn't want to sound like he's not creative. And so Ross, who's one of the smarter characters on the show, teaches him how to use a thesaurus and find similar words for the words he's trying to say. And it doesn't go quite the way that he wants it to.
Here's my recommendation. I think you'll be very, very happy. Longest I ever spent on a computer without looking at porn. I don't, understand. Some of the words a little too sophisticated for you.
It doesn't make any sense.
Well, of course it does. It's smart. I used a thesaurus. On every word? Yep.
What was this sentence originally?
Oh, they are warm, nice people with big hearts. And that became, they are humid, prepossessing Homo sapiens with full-sized aortic pumps. Yeah, and hey, I really mean it, dude.
Wait, Joey, I don't think we can use this.
Why not?
Well, because you signed it Baby Kangaroo Tribbiani. Hey, why don't you stop worrying about sounding smart and just be yourself?
You know what? You don't need a thesaurus. Just write from here. Your full-sized aortic pump.
So again, proceed with caution. It's good to have really clear and specific language for what you're trying to say, but you don't want to overdo it, and you don't want to use words in ways that you don't intend or you don't know what they mean. I showed that clip in Texas a few years ago, and it made me laugh that about 7 minutes later, one of my students said, "Oh, baby kangaroo, I get it." Yeah, so that happens. Oh well. Another thing that can be challenging is if you're working in a subject area and you have those big words, or you have names that are from another language that you don't speak, sometimes it can be hard to get those words out, to say them and to articulate them the right way, especially if you're not even sure how to pronounce them. What happens here, what you see below, is the name of a glacier in Iceland that happened to erupt a few years ago. And the glacier had a really long name, and people didn't know how to pronounce it, but they gave it their best, and it was not too easy. I happen to have a friend who spent a year studying in Iceland at the time, or shortly before this happened. And so we spent like half an hour where she was trying to teach all of her friends how to say this word. It's something like Eyjafjallajökull. You'll hear it in a second, but you'll also hear a whole bunch of people butcher it.
Underneath the Eyjafjallajökull Glacier. The eruption at the Eyjafjallajökull Glacier was the volcano underneath the Eyjafjallajökull Glacier. According to reports, the three eruptions of Eyjafjallajökull on record had eruption under the Eyjafjallajökull Glacier. Iceland's Eyjafjallajökull volcano roared back into life just weeks after it erupted for the first time in nearly 200.
Yes. So you can see that it's not always easy to pronounce certain words. I wrote my master's thesis a few years ago on a trial that took place after the Rwandan genocide, and I had names in there like Rugagoza, Rusesabagina, and really long Rwandan names. I don't know anyone who speaks Kinyarwanda. I haven't met people from Rwanda, and so I had to do my best with those names, even though I'm not entirely sure that I'm pronouncing them correctly. What a lot of speakers do when they run into situations like this is they kind of leave it up to the last minute and they're like, I'll figure it out in the moment. And so what they'll do is they'll say, Ayafia, in the middle of their speech, Ayafia, Ajafajad, and they'll spend 30 seconds trying to get through the word. Or what they'll do is pronounce it 30 different ways throughout their speech, and either way, it makes you look like you're not really confident as a speaker. There might not be the best way around this. The best way around this is probably to find someone who knows how to pronounce the word. So someone, if it's another culture, someone who speaks the language is usually the best way to get close to this. If you can't find those people or you're still not sure how to pronounce it, what you need to do is practice it as if you're going to say it correctly and say it consistently over and over and over again. A lot of people will butcher this and will look really stupid in doing so. So I'd encourage you to pick one and stick with it. And I've said before that speakers tend to think that audiences are really hostile and mean. Most people in your audience want you to succeed, and there might be someone in your audience who actually knows how to pronounce the word. And if you're consistent about it, if you really try, what's likely to happen is that person will come up to you at the end and say, you said this word this way, it's actually that way. And they won't interrupt you and be mean about it. But if you stutter and you stumble and you don't really get there, then they have more reason. Everyone in the audience has more reason to think that you're not totally confident or competent as a speaker. There's another thing that a lot of people do, and I even catch myself doing this a few times, is using what people call powerless language. Powerless language is language that signals to your audience that you're not really sure what it is that you're saying or how you're saying it. And there are a couple different types of powerless language, and it's really easy to fall into these traps. A lot of them are really common in vernacular spoken English when we have everyday conversation. So one of them is just having a lot of hesitations and verbal fillers, and a lot of people think this is closely tied to delivery, and in a lot of ways it is. So these are the words like well, maybe, or just long pauses where you're not sure what you're saying next. People have studied this, and what usually leads to those pauses and hesitations or those verbal fillers of and what usually leads to that is people don't strategically breathe. If you think about when you're going to pause and where you're going to pause, instead of rushing through a sentence and then getting stuck partway through it, it helps a little bit. So that's one way around it, is to really breathe strategically. Another way around it, and it's kind of a cruel and unusual punishment way of doing this, is to practice your speech and to say it. And every time you have a big pause or a big hesitation or verbal filler, have whoever's in your audience clap. And it's a rude awakening, and you'll kind of jolt every time that it happens, but you might not even realize how many times you use like. And so you want to make sure that you are aware of it so you can try and fix the problem. Another type of powerless language is hedging. Hedging is basically saying, I don't know what it is that I'm saying. I sometimes fall into this trap as well. There's this horrible song that came out a few years ago. I think that possibly, maybe, I'm falling for you. If you actually said that to someone, I don't think it would have quite the effect that you would want it to have. It's not really the most confident way of expressing your feelings. It's kind of wishy-washy and non-committal. So all of those words that you use to fill that are kind of in between, not really sure what they're saying, that's all hedging, and that's something that you want to try and cut out of your speech if you want to sound a little bit more confident as well. A third thing that people do is what's called tag questions, and this is just after you make a declarative statement and you want your audience to agree with you, you'll ask them if they agree with you. Don't you think? I know, right? Yeah, those are common endings that people will tack onto their speech, and it's a way of saying, yeah, I think I'm sure of what I'm talking about, but I'm not totally sure. Will you join me? I'm not entirely clear. The fourth type of powerless language is using disclaimers. And so this is a way of saying, again, I think I know what I'm talking about, but I don't actually know what I'm talking about. And it's a way of making yourself look better by saying, well, I might not know this, or it might not be totally right, or I'm not sure, but, and then saying your statement. And these are all ways to try and protect yourself and try to look like you're more clear about what it is that you're going to say, but sometimes your audience doesn't see it that way. And so that you might think that in your own head, but members of your audience are probably going to say, don't know if this person's totally capable. These are particularly things that you want to avoid on a job interview or on a date, but you want to be careful with how you use your language. There's a really great clip of another person who's picked up on this. Taylor Mali happens to be one of my big heroes. He's a teacher / comedian. He's picked up on just how bad the problem of powerless language is, and he says it much better than I do. So I'll let him do that.
In case you hadn't realized, it has somehow become uncool to sound like you know what you're talking about, or believe strongly in what you're, saying. Invisible question marks and parenthetical you knows and you know what I'm saying have been attaching themselves to the ends of our sentences, even when those sentences aren't, questions. Declarative sentences, so-called because they used to, declare things to be true, okay? As opposed to other things that are, totally, not. They've been infected by this tragically cool and totally hip interrogative tone. As if I'm saying, don't think I'm a nerd just because I've, noticed this, okay? I have nothing personally invested in my own opinions. I'm just, inviting you to join me on the bandwagon of my own uncertainty. What has happened to our conviction? Where are the limbs out on which we once walked? Have they been, chopped down with the rest of the rainforest? You know? Or do we have, nothing to say? Has society just become so filled with these conflicting feelings of that we've just gotten to the point where we're the most aggressively inarticulate generation to come along since, a long time ago. So I implore you, I entreat you, and I challenge you to speak with conviction. To say what you believe in a manner that bespeaks the determination with which you believe it. Because contrary to the wisdom of the bumper sticker, it is not enough these days to simply question authority. You gotta speak with it.
There you have it. I'll leave you with another hero of mine. So Taylor Mali happens to be one that I absolutely love. Another hero of mine for your inspiration is George Carlin. George Carlin is a very famous, very funny comedian. He has a bit called Modern Man, and I leave you with this one as inspiration because it is basically using every single figure of speech that I gave you and many more. It's a really powerful, short slam poetry piece, so I'll let you listen to that as well.
Thank you. I'm a modern man, the man for the millennium. Digital and smoke-free. A diversified, multicultural, postmodern deconstructionist, politically, anatomically, and ecologically incorrect. I've been uplinked and downloaded, I've been inputted and outsourced. I know the upside of downsizing, I know the downside of upgrading. I'm a high-tech lowlife, a cutting-edge, state-of-the-art, bi-coastal multitasker, and I can give you a gigabyte in a nanosecond. I'm new wave, but I'm old school, and my inner child is outward bound. I'm a hot-wired, heat-seeking, warm-hearted, cool customer, voice-activated and biodegradable. I interface with my database is in cyberspace, so I'm interactive, I'm hyperactive, and from time to time I'm radioactive. Behind the eight ball, ahead of the curve, riding the wave, dodging the bullet, pushing the envelope. I'm on point, on task, on message, and off drugs. I got no need for coke
speed. I got no urge to binge and purge. I'm in the moment, on the edge, over the top, but under the radar. A high-concept, low-profile, medium-range ballistic missionary. A streetwise smart bomb. A Top Gun bottom feeder. I wear power ties. I tell power lies. I take power naps. I run victory laps. I'm a totally ongoing Bigfoot slam dunk rainmaker with a proactive outreach. A raging workaholic. A working rageaholic. Out of rehab and in denial.
I'll go ahead and pause it there. If any of you want to watch the full bit in traditional George Carlin fashion, he gets pretty raunchy and pretty out there, but it's something that I really appreciate is that he's able to use so many different figures of speech. You probably heard some parallelism and some antithesis in there. There's lots of different figures of speech. And this is something to strive for, not necessarily to have that much of it, but recognize that he's not only written that speech, he didn't have any note cards in front of him. That was a memorized speech. It's really kind of powerful that he was able to craft and deliver something like that in the way that it was. It's something to strive for. I'll leave you by saying that I don't expect you to sound like George Carlin, and I'll also say that I don't want you to sound like Dr. Seuss. So there's probably a happy medium with figures of speech, but if anything, this will give you some inspiration to go out there and have some fun with your own speeches.